and former husband, the one and only George Jones.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I invite you to a story wrapped in silence, sealed in grief, and still echoing in the voices of those she left behind. She was the first lady of country music. Her voice could break hearts and mend them in the same breath. Her songs defined generations of American women, strong yet suffering, loyal but longing. But on April 6, 1998, the music stopped forever. Tammy Wynette died while resting on her couch in her Nashville home. That's what the public was told. Her husband, George Ritchie, said she passed peacefully in her sleep, taken by a blood clot to the lung. There was no ambulance, no doctor, no emergency call, just silence, then burial. And yet, 1 year later, her body was exhumed. Why? What were her daughters so desperate to uncover? What if the woman who sang "Stand by Your Man" had no one standing by her when it mattered most? Tonight, we go beyond the official reports, beyond the tributes and the headlines, into a private world of pain, prescription pills, and unanswered questions. Because Tammy Wynette didn't just die quietly. She may have died unheard. Ladies and gentlemen, before we return to that final silent night in Nashville, we must remember the woman the world once couldn't stop listening to. Tammy Wynette was born Virginia Wynette Pugh on May 5, 1942, in a Mississippi farmhouse with no electricity. Her father died when she was just 8 months old, and from that moment on, Tammy learned what loneliness felt like. She grew up working in the cotton fields, dreaming of a different life, one that didn't smell of dirt and hardship, one where she could be heard. At first, she pursued a career in cosmetology, but even as she curled hair and painted nails, her voice was whispering louder dreams. That voice, aching, raw, vulnerable, would soon find its way to Nashville, and once it did, country music would never sound the same again. By 1967, she had signed with Epic Records and released a string of hits that would define her legacy. Divorce, Till I Can Make It on My Own, Stand by Your Man, a song that made her a cultural lightning rod and a timeless icon. Her voice wasn't just country, it was survival, heartbreak, and dignity, all rolled into a trembling vibrato. She became known as the First Lady of Country Music, not because of her sales numbers, though they were impressive, but because her songs told the story of every woman who had ever loved too hard, been hurt too deep, or stayed too long. Offstage, however, Tammy's life was anything but harmonious. She was married 5 times, including to fellow country legend George Jones. Their marriage was passionate and famously chaotic, a tempest of love and alcoholism, breakups and makeups. Still, fans adored them. They were country music royalty, even as their castle crumbled behind closed doors. But after George Jones came George Ritchie, the man who would become her final husband and the last person to see her alive. Tammy's later years were marred by chronic health problems. She suffered from abdominal adhesions, the result of previous surgeries, and endured more than 30 operations throughout her life. The pain was relentless. So were the medications. She became dependent on painkillers, some prescribed, others perhaps not. Yet through it all, Tammy Wynette kept performing. Even as her body failed her, Tammy Wynette continued to sing, because the stage, however demanding, was the only place where she felt fully alive. To the world, Tammy remained elegant, composed, devoted. But behind the makeup, behind the sequins, behind that enduring smile, lived a woman who was slowly breaking down, and whose story would not end with applause. Ladies and gentlemen, by the mid-1990s, Tammy Wynette was a living legend, but she was also living in constant pain, physical, emotional, and some would later argue, psychological. Her marriage to George Ritchie, once seen as a stabilizing force after years of turmoil, had become something far more complex. Ritchie was not just her husband, he was her manager, her gatekeeper, and eventually her only point of contact with the outside world. He handled her business, controlled her schedule, and oversaw her access to medication. To some, this was devotion. To others, it was control. By this time, Tammy was almost entirely dependent on painkillers. She had endured procedure after procedure, so many, in fact, that her abdominal wall was severely damaged. Doctors warned that further surgery could be life-threatening, but the pain never left her. Neither did the drugs. Her daughters began to grow concerned. They claimed their mother was increasingly unreachable. Phone calls went unanswered. Visits were brief and closely monitored. When they did see her, Tammy appeared frail, foggy, distant. They suspected she was over-medicated, but any efforts to intervene were shut down quickly. George, they said, insisted everything was fine, that Tammy needed rest, that too many people around her only made things worse. Yet behind the closed doors of her Nashville home, the woman who once stood tall in rhinestones and silk now spent most of her days lying down, unable to eat without vomiting, her body rejecting even the most basic functions. And still, she performed. In February 1998, just 2 months before her death, Tammy joined a televised concert celebrating George Jones. The audience applauded, the cameras rolled, but those closest to her said it was clear she was fading. Her once powerful voice barely whispered. She was exhausted, gaunt, but determined to smile through the pain. And then came April. Tammy had been complaining of feeling unwell for days, but according to George, she refused to go to the hospital. On the night of April 6th, she laid down on the couch in the music room. George claimed he checked on her around 8 p.m. and found her not breathing. No ambulance was called, no emergency services. George simply phoned a private doctor, a family friend, who came hours later and signed off on the death certificate. The cause? A blood clot in the lung. There was no autopsy, no toxicology. Tammy was pronounced dead, and within days she was buried. To the public, it was presented as a peaceful end to a difficult life, a country queen finally at rest. But her daughters didn't believe that. They believed something was being hidden, something deadly. Ladies and gentlemen, grief often brings questions, but when grief is met with silence, it breeds suspicion. In the days following Tammy Wynette's death, her daughters began to notice things that didn't make sense. Why hadn't an ambulance been called the moment she stopped breathing? Why had there been no effort to revive her? Why had no autopsy been performed? And why, most hauntingly, had they not been allowed to say goodbye. They weren't notified immediately. Some learned of their mother's passing not from George Ritchie, but from the media. Others were told after the burial arrangements had already been made. Tammy was gone, and everything had already been decided. The more they asked, the more they were shut out. George maintained Tammy died peacefully in her sleep, that she'd been ill for a long time, and that she didn't want to die in a hospital. She said she wanted rest. But rest, the daughters insisted, didn't mean dying alone on a couch, surrounded not by family, but by shadows. By early 1999, the quiet unease had grown into a storm. Tammy's daughters filed a wrongful death lawsuit against George Ritchie and her physician, Dr. Wallace Marsh. They demanded her body be exhumed. They wanted an autopsy. They wanted answers. The media exploded. Headlines asked what fans dared not speak aloud. Had the Queen of Country Music been over-medicated, or worse? For the first time in almost a year, Tammy's voice returned to the public, not through music, but through the sound of shovels at her grave. Her casket was lifted from the ground and brought to the Tennessee Medical Examiner's office. What they found was sobering. Tammy's body contained prescription medications at levels far above therapeutic doses: Demerol, Versed, Phenergan, Dilaudid, medications typically used in surgical settings or under strict supervision. Experts noted that some of these drugs should never have been taken together. The risk of respiratory failure was real. The signs of overdose were undeniable. But there was a problem. Nearly a year had passed. The evidence, if there had ever been conclusive evidence, was weakened by time. And without a clear medical cause of death, the state declined to pursue criminal charges. Still, the questions lingered. George Ritchie denied all wrongdoing. He refused to speak publicly about the case. When pressed by reporters, he offered no comment. He would never again speak Tammy's name in front of cameras. The daughters eventually dropped the civil suit, not because they were satisfied, but because they were exhausted. As Jackie Daly, Tammy's eldest daughter, later said in an interview, "We wanted the truth, but the truth had been buried with her." Country music fans were stunned. Some refused to believe there was anything sinister. Others, especially women who had followed Tammy's career closely, saw something chilling in the silence, in the way a woman so iconic, so beloved, could vanish from the world with no real explanation. Tammy Wynette, who gave a voice to so many women who felt invisible, had herself become voiceless in death. And still, ladies and gentlemen, we haven't reached the most haunting part of the story. Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes the most painful part of a story is not the moment of death, but the silence that follows it. After the toxicology report came back, there were no criminal charges, no dramatic courtroom reckoning, no headlines reading "Justice for Tammy." What remained was a quiet, aching void, a collection of grief-stricken daughters, a public still stunned, and a man, George Ritchie, who simply moved on. He remarried a few years later, settled into a quieter life, and never gave an interview about Tammy again. For someone who once managed every breath of her schedule, every note of her music, and allegedly every pill she swallowed, he offered no closure. Meanwhile, Tammy's daughters lived with an unbearable truth. They would never know what really happened. Whether her mother had overdosed accidentally, been given too much medication, or quietly surrendered to a life of suffering she could no longer bear, it was all speculation. Because when the time came to ask those questions, to demand real answers, Tammy was already gone, and no one had been watching. But her legacy, ladies and gentlemen, did not vanish. In 2008, a bronze sculpture of Tammy Wynette was erected on the grounds of the Country Music Hall of Fame. She stood tall, smiling, holding a microphone, immortalized in the pose that defined her life. The pain was nowhere to be seen, the questions buried with the woman. Yet those who knew her best, especially her daughters, still carry the weight of that final day. Jackie Daly once recalled holding her mother's old perfume bottle, whispering into the air, "I hope she knew we were trying to reach her." Because in the end, Tammy Wynette wasn't just a voice. She was a daughter, a mother, a woman who gave the world everything, except, perhaps, the truth about how her story ended. Her final performance didn't take place on stage. It happened in silence, behind closed doors, without applause. But it echoes still, in every woman who wonders if someone they love is quietly suffering. In every daughter who fears they're too late. After all, ladies and gentlemen, behind every legend is a human heart, fragile, complicated, and far too often misunderstood. Ladies and gentlemen, what do we do when the truth never arrives? What do we do when the story ends, not with a revelation, but with a lingering question? Tammy Wynette gave her life to her art. Her voice became the anthem of devotion, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of women everywhere. She sang of standing by your man, even when it hurt. She sang of heartbreak and resilience, of pain and survival. And yet, when it was her turn to be stood by, was anyone truly there? Was her final breath a peaceful one? Or was it the quiet collapse of a woman worn down by pills, pressure, and isolation? Can someone die of a blood clot and also die of being unheard? Dear viewers, perhaps this story isn't just about Tammy Wynette. Perhaps it's about every person we love from afar. Every idol we assume is safe because they smile. Every mother, every sister, every friend who says, "I'm fine," when they're anything but. So I ask you, what is the price of silence? What do we owe the ones who gave us everything when they finally ask for nothing? And when the applause fades, and the curtain falls, and the rhinestones are put away, how do we remember someone who may have died not because of fame, but in spite of it? Ladies and gentlemen, Tammy Wynette's voice still haunts the radios, but it's what she couldn't say that haunts those who loved her most. This has been Whispers of Country. Thank you for listening and remembering.